Thanks to Michael John, thanks also to Carlin. There are two circles of jokes in the world, the lawyer jokes and the viola jokes, and I'm actually the perfect intersection, the Venn diagram of all those jokes. So I couldn't be more pleased to be anywhere really than Science Gallery. I think what has happened here is so exciting. And this is a place where ideas find flywheels to ride. And it's a place where the beautiful and the puzzling are constantly coming into juxtaposition. I also love it that this is associated with Trinity College because, like all great universities, Trinity is a place, a free and ordered space where every room stands in for the community where it lives. So this is still a rather young institution, but it's already met the dreams of its founders. It's a place where people are sparked with cross-disciplinary interest in science and technology, and where hundreds of thousands of people come to visit, and they'll come back again and again. But just imagine how many more people the Science Gallery could be reaching with a fiber optic connection in each home in Ireland. That's the subject of my talk today. Imagine if you weren't just streaming this talk on compressed video, so it was a passive, recipient-based experience in people's homes, but actually you were bringing more people into the conversation through multiple streams of video, uncompressed. So it'll be more people than just me talking, lots of virtual representations of visitors to the Science Gallery. Imagine all that. You will say, well, we have internet access. And, well, the advent of the internet was certainly an exciting and inspirational time. Like lots of people of a certain age, I distinctly remember my first online interactive site. I was sitting in a law firm in Washington, D.C., my first legal job to pay off my debts. And I'm from Santa Monica, California, and the site was called The Spot. And it was a Santa Monica beach house. This is 1995. And the text on the site, I've got it here, it said, this looked amazing to me. Immerse yourself in the sun, sand, and secret journals of 5 20-somethings living under one roof. And it said, we can also interact with you, but only if you come in. And then there was a link under come in. And I know this is unbelievable, but I remember pressing that link. And it felt as if the back of the computer had fallen away. It was a lion, witch, and wardrobe moment for me. So the internet was big in 94, 95, but none of us could have predicted just how transformative it was. I remember some of my very first personal email messages. I was a law school classmate of Larry Lessig's. We graduated in 1989, to date ourselves. And I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that he was using so much lowercase font with dots. And then what was that @ sign doing? We never use an @ sign. Why was that in the middle? So we never imagined what could happen with the internet, with open standards and the connectivity that it provided for us. My message for you today, and each talk has only one message, so this is it. My message for you today is that we are about to undergo the same kind of shift. It's different, but it's equally enormous. And that is that Asian countries and some Northern European countries are already making the upgrade to fiber optic connectivity to homes and businesses. One strand of fiber has thousands of times more capacity than the last generation of internet access technologies, than DSL or cable, much less satellite with its tremendous distance from the earth, or wireless with its low capacity and constant interference by things like rain and trees. Fiber allows for equal uploads as well as downloads, so it allows for equal creativity by the people like the ones who come to the Science Gallery who want to be inventing things. And it's highly scalable. We're going to see enormous upgrades in fiber itself. Once the fiber is laid, by just swapping out the electronics, we'll be able to build bandwidth in unthinkable ways. Once that fiber is in place to every home in our country, in the US, or let's talk about Ireland, I'll spend some time on Ireland here, The productivity-enhancing potential of fiber is unimaginable. It's as big a change to people's lives as electrification was, and as major a change as the internet. The kind of literacy, you'll love this, the kind of literacy we'll come to treasure will be video literacy, not just text, but our ability to deal with video and deal with the symbols of video and manipulate it. It's impossible to say what's going to happen in a world of homes connected to fiber. Who could have predicted what the internet could bring? Why didn't we just stick with the Spot, that beach house with all the 20-year-olds that I was so enamored of? Well, clearly we didn't, and human beings are resilient and cheerful. So let me do a little bit of this imagining. Imagine improving health by having doctors able to actually visit their patients where they live, and with high-definition video connections, see their patients' affect, emotions, feelings, symptoms, at the same time that the doctors are able to access all of that patient's data. Imagine making it possible for high school students in this country, in any country, to supplement their in-class experience, and I'm a professor, so I'm going to say there's still a place for in-class experience, but to supplement that with real-time experiential learning from the very best people in their field at a distance. Imagine that. Imagine the transformative potential of that. Imagine real-time translation from any language on the fly as you're sitting there talking to them because of the high capacity and computational resources you can call upon. Here's another piece of imagine. Say you've got a tanker trailer near a city, near here, and that tanker trailer has just overturned, sending chlorine gas into the atmosphere. Sensors mounted on utility poles could pick up the plume of gas immediately, sense that it was there, and then send that information quickly by fiber to supercomputers that could crunch the data and start to predict what the form of that plume was going to take given existing weather conditions. Then that information could be combined with real-time 3D maps of the city and plans of the buildings in that city. Then emergency personnel could get all of that information, send out signals to all of us on our smartphones, mobile phones, and we'd all get the message because with fiber capacity, we'll be able to use our smartphones in times of crisis. They won't get overloaded. Circuits will be available to us. Individuals inside that city could get messages, emergency messages about where to go, which buildings to evacuate, what routes to take out of the city, and all of this could happen at the speed of light. Emergency personnel can be out on the streets guiding people around. None of this is effortless, but imagine what's possible when data can get wherever it needs to without impediment. Imagine genuine citizen engagement. So here we are at the Science Gallery, and there's a great exhibit on, which I urge you all to see if you haven't seen it already, called Hack the City. So what say we could do some city planning using estimates of how much tax revenue you're going to get, so the base rates would be set. Everybody in the community could be given access to sliders by which they could sort of vote with their slider to say, here's where I want to see money spent. I want to see money spent on parks or schools or education. All of that information could then be rendered in 3D modeling into visual representations of the future. It's like It's a Wonderful Life, except for city planning. And then you could host a gallery of all of those visions of the future. People could comment on each one of the visions with video embedded in each picture of the future. It's like The Sims, except with 3D modeling and better connectivity. That's true citizen engagement without having to go to a planning meeting necessarily. Just by wielding a slider and having that evoke a vision of the future, we could see what we were planning. And we only make progress when we see something. This is all possible with, let's say, a gig to everyone's homes, 1,000 megabits per second, 1 billion bits per second, multiple uncompressed video streams to every home. That's what Google is planning in its network that it's going to launch in Kansas City coming up in about 2 days from now. Fiber to the home. Also, fiber policy is wireless policy. You're probably sitting there thinking about your wireless devices. 95% of any wireless network is the wire. That communication has to hop on a wire to go anywhere. So with fiber deep into cities and then actually connected to houses and residences, all of our wireless devices will have plenty of capacity. Imagine if you make a city into a platform, have sensors on every surface, then you can be watching for things like air pollution, traffic congestion, all of this automatically. So we'll see integrated wireless sensor networks tied into city planning and city management. So here's the challenge, the scientists and the artists. This is the perfect place for this, actually. To imagine what's possible, to imagine if processing isn't a bottleneck, it's getting cheaper all the time, and connectivity isn't a bottleneck. Data can get wherever it needs to, as fast as it needs to. You need to show us that future, because again, we only make progress when we see things. It's a fascinating challenge. People won't be doing what they do now faster. They'll be doing different things, different ways of making a living, different new ideas. Every surface around us can become a writable screen. That's why video literacy is going to become so important. This shift has really caught my imagination, and I hope it catches yours. For this next part of my life, I want to spend time talking to people about the importance of this shift to fiber and this upgrade. And just to understand that, like electrification, it's a difference in kind, not just in speed. The advent of this real-time network of video could, if we do this right, if we do it for everybody, for mankind, as they say, will lay the groundwork for a stronger, more sustainable future for the global economy. Better use of energy, better use of human resources. If you don't have fiber access to your home or to your place of work, there are some companies with leased lines here in Dublin who do have that fiber access, but most people don't. If you don't have it, it is hard to imagine what it's like. People who get this access never want to go back. They don't want to roll back to cable or DSL. People will say that this is a luxury. It's not. It's going to become a necessity of life. It's a building block for the future. As democratic societies, we have an obligation to make sure that everyone, even the most vulnerable among us, has this kind of access, just as we made sure they had access to a phone. We need to create the conditions that allow people to innovate and create wealth and jobs. We need tools to imagine with. We want to spark innovation. This future has to be evenly distributed. That's the whole point. We have to make sure that this helps the entire fabric of society, not that just the rich, that this is available at a reasonable cost. And here's where the dark parts come in. So now I've spun out for you all the great visions of what could be possible. I've challenged you to show us that vision. Here are the stumbling blocks. There are 3 parts to the electronic revolution: processing, storage, and connectivity. Processing and storage are all becoming vanishingly cheap. Cost curves are all plummeting. Not so for connectivity, at least not in ordinary homes in Ireland and in the US. Now, in other countries, that's not true. In Hong Kong, in China, in Japan, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, soon in Australia, very high-speed fiber connectivity to homes is routinely available. Other countries are doing national upgrades, which means they'll be inventing the next great things, generating all those new jobs and those new ways of making a living that require this abundance. In those countries, I have this message for you, it's cheap. It's cheap. Here's what you can get for about 28 euros a month. 28 euros. In Hong Kong, you can get a symmetrical connection of 500 megabits, 500 down, 500 up. In Tokyo, for about 25 euros a month, you can get a 200 megabit down and up fiber connection. In Paris, 100 down and 50 up. In London, 60 megabits down and the same up. By contrast, in Dublin, I looked at the regulator's most recent report. Smart Telecom has an offer of 24 megabits down and 1 up, which you can get for about 28 euros a month, with a data cap of about 350 gigabytes. In New York, my home city, the situation's about the same. For about $35 a month, you can get 25 down, 2 up. These sound like numbers, but actually they add up to quality of life. It's seen to be scarce and expensive, this kind of connectivity, in both your country and mine. So what the heck is going on? How is it that storage and processing is as cheap as we can imagine, and fiber is either not available or incredibly expensive? I will tell you. The answer is policy. It really is just like electrification. In the 1920s, 90% of American farmers did not have electricity at the same time that everybody in New York City did. How'd that happen? How was it that rich children in New York City were playing with electric toys when farmers didn't have access to electricity for their livelihoods? And it was wildly expensive in the farming places where it was available. Well, although electricity is now considered an essential input into everything we do, just think for a moment about all the electricity involved in this event. At the time, it was seen like a luxury, seems a luxury just for the rich. And so the private companies that were selling electricity only served the rich in America and left out the farms. And they left in big businesses and left out small ones. The electricity business, just like the fiber business, involves very high upfront costs. So if you can make that initial investment, if you build that initial electrical network, it serves as an extraordinarily effective barrier to entry for any competition. And you can pick off the rich customers because you know they're going to be willing to pay a lot and leave the other ones for any second comer. Then they'll be stuck with serving people who are more spread out and not as wealthy. Then once your lucrative electrification business is in place, you can start to harvest. You can just raise prices because it's very unlikely that anybody else will come in and compete with you. The incumbents in the electricity world did their level best. This surprised me. They did their level best to stop towns from serving their own citizens with electricity. Even though the electrical companies themselves weren't interested in serving those towns, they wanted to make sure that nobody broke the mold, that nobody revealed that it was actually pretty cheap to bring electricity to other places without having to go through their gates. The municipal electric advocates were actually called Marxists, and the service was labeled too expensive to build. And so it took tremendous leadership in the United States. In our case, it took Franklin Roosevelt, who often went to Warm Springs, Georgia, to swim. And he was horrified at how expensive and really unavailable electricity was in Georgia. And although he himself was a very wealthy and privileged guy, he was bothered by this. And he instinctively understood that the health and welfare of the entire nation depended on everybody having electricity, both for people to thrive and for American industry to have a market to sell new goods into. He did see this as a moral issue, that equality demanded it, not just the market imperatives, but actually the fair treatment of other Americans. And so FDR mounted enormous rural electrification efforts. He actually staked his whole political future on this and faced very stiff opposition from the incumbents who didn't want to see the change. He regulated those companies. And after tremendous uphill political wrangling, the goal became a fair profit for a good service provided to all Americans. Universal service, we called it. In America, we're quite parochial. We call this universal service, even though it only serves Americans. So that's what happened in electrification. That is the story. And today, the US and Ireland are really in a dark hole, I'm afraid, when it comes to fiber access, just as America was when it came to electricity 100 years ago. My country's upgrade to fiber will not happen absent a strong government intervention in policy. I'm saddened by what has happened to my country's communications policy. Although our US telephone system was the envy of the world when it was built, it was quite advanced, and served every American at a reasonable price, we're apparently unable to think of fiber as a utility, although it's the new general purpose network. As a result, we've fallen far behind and are likely to fall farther, which isn't good for any part of American society. In fact, this is just amplifying, deepening the inequality that's already tearing the country apart. Here's what happened in the US. Back about 10 years ago, a DSL service over a copper line and cable modem service over the cable plant were roughly competitive with each other. They had about the same speeds, cost about the same. And the cable guys pressed for and received deregulatory treatment. The FCC said you don't have to act like a traditional communications carrier. The argument was that competition would protect consumers from the abuses of the cable company or the telephone company. They'd be battling it out in the marketplace, and that would protect consumers. And then the telephone company and the wireless companies followed, and they said, well, level playing field, if the cable guys get deregulated, we should be too. And as a result, we left in place no oversight whatsoever for data services in America. No requirement to share infrastructure, no cop on the beat to protect consumers and businesses. And then it turned out that that competition I described to you was ephemeral. The cable industry discovered that it's actually pretty inexpensive to upgrade their networks to faster download speeds. They don't have to dig up the cable wire. They just change the electronics on the edges of the network. And they were able to bulk up their network to, say, 100 megabit down, 50 megabit down speeds. You can think of a cable pipe as just a gigantic digital set of channels, hundreds of them. Most of them are devoted to video. Just 4 are bonded together for internet access. And the cable industry said, we're going to keep those 4 in place, and that's going to be internet access. And it's fast. So the result was a pretty fast service, asymmetrical, very slow uploads, even if fast downloads, and so more passive kind of network experience. But they didn't have to dig up the pipe. The phone companies, by contrast, had a much more expensive road ahead of them. They would have to get rid of copper, take it out, dig up the streets, put in fiber, much more expensive. And it was expensive from Wall Street's point of view. And the phone companies, after deregulation, saw themselves and wanted to be valued much more like media companies, paying very large dividends with very high short-term profits and margins. So their Wall Street investors were pummeling them and saying, don't invest, don't upgrade to fiber, because that's going to drive down your stock price and will limit the amount of dividends you're going to have to be able to pay. So, meanwhile, this is a very dramatic story, isn't it? So the cable companies then consolidated, because we've learned over and over again that where consolidation is possible, competition is impossible. Cable companies consolidated their systems, clumped them together. They actually had something they called the Summer of Love, where they swapped systems. You take Minneapolis, I'll take San Francisco. So they never enter each other's territories, and they control whatever markets they're in. So today, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, Denver are all Comcast cities. That's the local cable monopolist there. And Time Warner has its own places. Comcast is much bigger, Time Warner is smaller. The phone companies, seeing this happen and seeing how expensive it was for them to upgrade, decided to leave the field. To have the wired upgrades be done by the cable companies, not phone. So they said, you take wires, we'll take wireless. That's what's happened in America. So AT&T and Verizon, our big phone companies, are totally focused on wireless, where they still make pretty large profits. And they're running away from their DSL installations. And they're not upgrading to fiber. Okay? So this was all made completely clear at the end of last year when Verizon and Comcast and Time Warner decided to collaborate to jointly market each other's services. If you're fiercely competing with each other, which was the predicate for all this deregulation, if you're fiercely competing, you don't co-market your stuff. So pretty clear that there's a lot of collaboration going on and a market division effort underway, which makes sense from Wall Street's point of view. Now, of course, wireless isn't a real substitute for the speeds you can get over cable. It's very useful for mobility, and we love it. But you wouldn't start a business using only a smartphone connection. It's just not reliable enough. But wireless is certainly beloved and required for nomadic use, and AT&T's and Verizon's margins are in the 40% range for wireless. Okay, so that's the drama. As a result of all this, for the 100 megabit down speeds that cable can provide, for 85% of Americans, Their only choice is their local cable monopolist. They've got nowhere else to go. There isn't a fiber option. They just have to sign up with cable. For the speeds they're going to need to watch video, remember, not much uploading, but lots of watching, they'll be using their cable actor. And that local monopoly can charge whatever it wants to for those services. And those services are a second-class network. It's not fiber, it's just cable. Not the global standard, not the future-proof symmetrical network, not the creative network of abundance and unlimited capacity. And these cable companies have every incentive to keep the status quo in place, not to shift, to stifle innovation. And their gatekeeper role has two sides. Not only can they charge you and me whatever they want, they can also charge any businesses trying to reach you and me whatever they want, or any networks trying to connect to their network whatever they want. It's as if each high bandwidth business, think Netflix, is a small child in the schoolyard trying to get home and facing a bunch of bullies between the schoolyard and their home. How's that high bandwidth business actually going to reach subscribers? They're probably going to have to pay a tribute to the cable guy who stands in the middle between them and their own ability to make money. So the cable company can make the path technically uncertain in a host of ways, charge a bunch of fees, charge networks to interconnect with them. There are innumerable ways to do this, lots of gears to turn, lots of levers to pull, once you're the only player in town. And you can claim, this is the beautiful part of it, you can claim that scarcity requires you to prioritize and shape and change because there just isn't that much room available, you will say. And no one ever thinks to remind you that it's actually just, you chose 4 channels of your hundreds anyway. But no one also ever seems to notice that cable companies' actual expense of providing access is only about 3% of its access revenues. One analyst has said that this is an almost laughably lucrative business. Really, invest in cable in the United States. It's a fabulous stock at this point. They're doing extremely well. So in the end, they can frustrate entire communities and the overall social and economic health of the country just so they can make as much money as possible, which is rational. These are great American companies and they're success stories. But this area, providing a basic communications network to everyone in the country, is one in which the incentives of private companies don't align well with the incentives of the country as a whole. It really cannot be left to the whims of the private market, unrestrained. So seeing all this, a few cities in America have tried to do this for themselves by authorizing alternative fiber networks. It's been a huge battle politically because the incumbents are really extremely powerful. And in 19 out of our 50 states, it's now either illegal or extremely difficult for a city to build fiber for itself. I hope some of you are shocked by this. There are bright spots. There is leadership. Chattanooga, Tennessee, we all talk about in the US, they actually strung fiber along their electrical utility. And as a result, it has the nation's fastest fiber network and the first true smart grid. I'm sure some of you have heard of smart grid. The idea is that each home and business can be keeping track of its energy use so that you can moderate that use both for conservation purposes and also for your own economic purposes. And that will help prevent power outages and enable much greater conservation. The city's streetlights in Chattanooga are actually controlled by sensors, by LEDs, that react to the light and decide whether or not to turn off or on by themselves without needing somebody to have an automatic off and on switch. But most importantly, from a human perspective, Chattanooga, Tennessee is a place where after kids have gone away to college, they're coming back. They're starting new businesses. It's a vibrant, creative place. Some of that has to do with the fiber network that's now in place. New startups are certainly moving there in droves. So Knoxville, a few hundred miles away, businesses are leaving Knoxville to come to Chattanooga because of the connectivity. New jobs, new good jobs, and you get to stay in the place you love. Same kind of story for Cleveland, Ohio, which is a Rust Belt city that's fallen on rough times. They've built a gigabit network. Look, this is really all about respect and dignity and innovation, and Cleveland sees itself as being the heart of a lot of medical applications. You could make sure that doctors practice surgery on patients' own data with very realistic simulations, and Cleveland wants to be the heart of that. And they also say, look, if you're starting a light bulb factory, come to Cleveland. Manufacturing should be here, jobs should be here and not in China, and we think this gigabit network is going to do that. Have cloud computing businesses big back here. But other than those bright spots in the States where independent fiber has been forced into the system and the incumbents have had to compete with it, we're in a situation where we won't have symmetrical fiber in the US without policy changes. We just won't. Verizon sells a fiber service, but remember, they've backed off. It's only available to 14% of Americans, and their CEO has said no more expansion. So a little bit of fiber and only in demographically suitable places. Cable is not going to expand. They're not going to charge reasonable rates for globally relevant access or build fast, symmetrical fiber to the home networks. For the uploads that we'd need, what the Science Gallery would need in particular, they'd have to replace every single element of their network. They'd have to swap out everything, all the consumer equipment, everything inside their network in order to make those big uploads possible. Why would they do that? They're under no competitive pressure and no cop on the beat oversight regulatory pressure. But as a country, my country is under incredible pressure to create jobs. And Ireland, of course, is too. And it's far harder to invent and innovate when you can't even turn the lights on, which is the situation we're both in. So the US, the world's largest economy, is behind on speed as well as cost. South Korea, Hong Kong, Romania, Portugal, Japan, they're all ahead of the US. Meanwhile, these cable companies are challenged neither by competition nor by oversight, and it's shocking. And what I'm worried about is I'm afraid you're going to see the same picture in Ireland. In this country, you've got a per capita broadband adoption rate of about 24%, and it's mostly DSL, which is the copper-based service, really the old-fashioned service. But it's clear that Irish people are craving speed. In the first quarter of this year, 2012, about 20% of all the broadband subscriptions were for speeds that were greater than 10 megabits per second. So 20% chose this faster speed, much faster than DSL, right? That's twice the percentage of people from just a year ago who chose those faster speeds. So there's clearly a yearning for greater speed. And much of that growth is from people leaving DSL or coming newly to broadband, but they're leaving DSL and they're going straight to, you guessed it, cable. UPC is getting a lot of that growth. And they've doubled their market share to over 20% because that slow DSL is not enough to compete. UPC, according to the regulator here, also charges a lot for its 20 megabit per second down service. And remember, the up is really constrained, it's mostly down. It's the most expensive high-speed offering across Europe except for Spain, friends. That's what's happening here in Ireland. And all of this, I'm afraid, is exactly what happened in the US. People left DSL in droves, but all they've got in most places in the US is the cable guy who's making 90% plus profits in the US for broadband with huge margins. Again, great for shareholders, not great for the country. And with 14.8% unemployment here in Ireland and extensive youth emigration, seems to me that Ireland is in need of an upgrade to fiber. Eircom used to have that monopoly and all those high prices. After years of stock issues, let's say, they couldn't pay their debt, they went broke. They're now emerging from bankruptcy with Blackstone as their largest shareholder. And they've promised to upgrade their DSL lines. Well, Eircom really should do a fiber build at this point, quickly. Remember, DSL is just crappy copper. It's the thing that Verizon and AT&T are abandoning in the DSL in the United States. And copper is not going to allow Ireland to compete for jobs and new ideas with the other countries of the world. But here's my worry, really. Eircom probably won't do this with Blackstone involved. Blackstone's a private equity firm. They'll be looking to use this asset as a basis for increased leverage for all of their business. They'll be looking for short-term returns, which won't be provided unless, again, poor people are left out, rich people are gouged, and they do the minimum possible and then exit. That's what a private equity firm does. They're not in the business of long-term commodity social investment. that we've needed for telephone, electricity, and all these other utilities that serve everybody in the country. So take it from me, private equity firms are probably not the right partner for a fiber upgrade to the entire country. So what you need from your country, she said blithely, is independence from Aircom and the cable companies. Cities and towns should require that Aircom leave space in whatever conduit exists between homes and backbones. There should be space in there for independent fiber, just a place where another company could show up and serve that home, so that you don't get locked into these incumbents who only have the status quo in mind. Also, there should be low-interest, long-term financing that's backed by cities and the government available to competitors who want to serve Irish people. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's the financing, actually, that's key. Remember that the big barrier to entry here is spending the money to get the network rolled in the first place. If you can get long-term, low-interest financing and have that backed by the name of the government, you can make this a long-term utility play. You know, being a gravel pit is actually pretty good business. You get low returns, but they keep coming in for years and years. But first you need to build the gravel pit. And we saw this with the telephone and with electricity. We now need to do this again with fiber. We can just ignore the cable companies. Let them continue to provide their second best network. They will have to compete with fiber. And you need independence from these short-term private interests of both cable cos and incumbent telcos. They want the status quo, you don't. You don't want the status quo for Ireland. More than 100 years ago, we used to think we needed electricity only for street lamps. Can you imagine that? That was the only imagined use for electricity. People couldn't think of anything else you would do with it. And so the manufacturing companies actually mounted these enormous World's Fairs. And these World Fairs were transformative events for the hundreds of thousands, millions of people who went to them. And they were actually demonstrations of electricity. So people went to these things and had their lives changed. Oh my good, you can do this in the kitchen and you can do that. And the World's Fair made that possible. In fact, remember the very beginning of this, I talked about the science gallery sparking new ideas and lights go on when we think of something new. All of that comes from this exciting period when electrification first came to the world, because it was such a change. We need to go through that same kind of change, this time for fiber. What we don't have yet is the World's Fair. And this is where the science gallery comes in. I think this is a terrific challenge, Michael John, so I hope you'll take this on. You tell us you understand the creative potential of high-speed uploads. You have the imagination to put on a World's Fair of fiber use, the likes of which has never been seen before. What's possible when processing is unlimited and data gets where it needs to go at the speed it needs to travel? What's possible? Then you have to give that act of invention political power. That's the next problem after the World's Fair. People should be elected in Ireland on the basis of their commitment to bring fiber to every home, just as 100 years ago or more we might have elected people based on their commitment to electrification. Everything else we need to do to solve this country's problems and the world's problems, health, energy, education, new ideas, all of that requires a world-class communications network. But getting there is going to require real citizen dedication. So that's my message to you. I'm tempted to say Godspeed, but it isn't really God's hand at work here. These were man-made problems, and man can solve them. It's human ingenuity and political will that's going to fix this. But we do need the speed part. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Extremely interesting. And
Was it interesting? Okay, good. Good.
And I was going to say, with pun intended, enlightening comparison to the electricity network, because it just gives a whole different context, I think, to think about some of these big issues where we've lost the perspective in which we can approach them and then think our way through the issue. I think what I want to do is, I have a few questions I want to kick off with to ask Susan, and I want you to be thinking of things that you'd like to ask, because I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes and ask you to ask what you want to know about. But I think listening to that, the obvious question that springs to mind is, why are we where we are? I mean, if you've worked within the Obama administration closely, and I know from, we were talking earlier today about your experiences there, and Susan was saying what an incredibly smart and focused group of people were gathered together in to consider things like technology policy. Why were previous administrations just not watching this issue emerge? Is the Obama administration interested in this? Or is it one of these kind of things that is just, I mean, I know myself, this has kind of happened over time in the US without us really noticing it. And it's only when you've given this context, I thought, my God, that's so true. Everything is now cable companies.
Yeah. I want to give credit to Michael Powell, who was the FCC chairman under Bush and is a very able guy. I think he genuinely believed that competition between cable and phone would protect consumers, and that there would be sort of a marketplace battle, and regulation seems so old-fashioned to him. I want to give that intellectual belief credence. What happened after that is it turns out not to be true, because it is so much cheaper to upgrade cable than it is to upgrade the phone system. And I don't know if anybody could have anticipated that, really. The reason why Larry Lessig has gone into campaign finance instead of copyright is that the root of a lot of these problems has to do with the influence of these incumbents in Washington. And FDR, when he was doing the electrification issue, told the country that he was worried about the special interests, the electrical companies, that were attacking him. So nothing's changed. It's the same. These are very well-organized interests who can keep talking about the genius of the private market. And the response takes a couple of sentences. The response is, we love private markets too, but you need a sidewalk for the private markets to operate on fairly. You don't have a fair market, free market, without this, sidewalk in place. That takes 2 sentences. We only have time to hear one. And so the American political class easily says, oh, you're just trying to regulate the internet. Mm-hmm. That's the phrase that comes back. And you're just trying to destroy private innovation and private ingenuity. And it's very difficult for people to hear the longer message.
In the same way, you were talking about Lawrence Lessig backing, moving from copyright to what he sees as something that lies before. I would presume you would see yourself doing the same and having been associated strongly with the issue of net neutrality. But this is kind of the infrastructure that you need before you can consider those larger issues. Was that how you see it?
Well, actually, the way I see net neutrality is kind of the white bird on top of the hippo. The big issue is the broken marketplace, the lack of competition and the control that these gatekeepers have. Because they can claim the existence of scarcity and say we've got to manage everything because we don't have an abundant network and we don't want to have to invest or expand. They say net neutrality threatens their ability to do business, right? Because they say we need to be able to prioritize and channel, but that's just a symptom of the underlying cause, which is no abundance and lack of certainty in the freeway. I keep using these very physical metaphors because they grab people. Eisenhower built the highway system in America, a Republican, by the way. It is impossible for me to imagine Americans doing something like that today, saying we need to build a national system. We really have to go through a whole period of sort of re-education about what the role of government is in providing these basic public services. So.
And how does that come about? I mean, is that the citizen role for all of us to put that pressure? Because I was going to ask you, does government any longer have that kind of big vision? You don't think right now that
what I have faith in is the 20-somethings. My students are tremendous, and they're going to get this. I think the baby boomers screwed this up. We did. We're on the edge of the, right?
We're the
very
tail
end of the baby boom generation.
So we can sit on the fence.
But I do think that there was a sort of sense like, oh, government programs are boring. You know, that's old stuff that our parents cared about. And we just care about individualism and the free market. So that generation, that was their whole thing. Now, my students, the 20-year-olds, 20-somethings, I think have more of a sense of public obligation. When I was here last in December, the whole Occupy thing was going on in front of the bank building. I noticed they're no longer there. I walked by. And, but there are a lot of young people involved in that who worry about the future of their entire country, not just them. So I have some confidence, and this is actually part of my plan for the next 5 years, that talking to college students, getting them interested in public service and interested in these great big issues, and then making them voting issues, that's what changes this. Not just waving flags and marching, but actually making sure that at every debate, every political candidate has to answer the question, what are you doing to bring fiber to the home access in our cities at a reasonable cost? What are you doing? And until it becomes a salient issue and people feel they're being elected on it or not, we're not going to get any traction. So I see young people plus lots of questions, good questions at debates, plus I think there is a crisis. This is just like banking. Another system that should be operating in a commodity way to support the free market in a sort of predictable way. And it was, unregulated and sort of getting out of control. Then we hit a wall in the United States, and the whole world saw that happen, and we at least lurched forward, tried to do some kind of oversight of that system. This communications issue is also getting to be a crisis in America. And with things like this Google Kansas City network and the Chattanooga network being demonstration projects, actually showing people what it's like to have inexpensive, fast, transformative connectivity, that I think is going to show the whole country that the rest of it is being left behind. And particularly, I hope that our sense of social conscience wakes back up. We are deepening inequality, at least in my country, by the way that we're wielding communications networks.
Okay, and I just have one more comment, and then I want to switch it over to the audience, so please have your questions in mind. But you were just speaking about how you like illustrative metaphors, and I cannot resist quoting you from one of the pieces that you've written, where Susan's described, she says, the American consumer will be that frog that is forever being boiled. Slightly uncomfortable, but oblivious as the heat and pricing continues to rise. And I thought that is. Do you feel, in order to maybe calm the boiling, do public-private partnerships work, or given that competition in the private market hasn't in that area, or is that yet another sticky area, and does this need pure government intervention?
Well, we have a tradition in America of having private companies build these networks, but then they're burdened with public obligations. And we've just been doing this for more than 100 years. We will continue to do that. What's happened right now is that the private interests have swamped the public obligations. There's sort of no room left for the public obligations. It's only the market interests. What we need to do is bring the whole thing back into balance. But I actually don't think that the government itself should be running these networks. It should have policies in place that keep that conduit open so that independent fiber can show up. It should be backing those low interest loans so that people can build. And it should be requiring that you're either a conduit provider or you're a content provider. I didn't even get into this, but that we don't want to have the built-in conflict of interest where people want to favor their own stuff. So we just saw the merger in the US between Comcast and one of our 4 giant media conglomerates, NBCU. And that gives Comcast a giant conflict of interest. So another role of government is to say, you're either one or the other. This is easy, no problem.
Mm-hmm. Question? So I think up here we have the mic coming down, so I'll be here. We can start over here, please.
Hi. You mentioned that the municipal networks in chunk of the U.S. is a little bit illegal. I don't understand how they're making that illegal.
Hard to imagine, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there are in place now 19 state laws saying that a locality is not either making it impossible or making it very difficult for a locality to build a network for itself. How did that happen? Lobbying. Lobbying. That's how it happened.
Is that not like taking away the rights to individuals somehow?
You know, move to America. That this happened, and one of the reasons it's happened is that the Supreme Court read part of the Communications Act to say, there's actually a line in the Communications Act that says any entity should be able to sell communication service, any entity, right? That language was read to exclude localities. So then, so we've had a few things that have added up to making it actually illegal in many places. And these, look online for what just happened in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. There's a actually concerted effort to pass state laws across America to make it illegal for localities to do this for themselves. You'd think, what happened to the Tea Party? What happened to the rabid conservatives who want, you know, local power? Well, apparently they got rolled too. I mean, I don't know how they didn't notice this, but it's now impossible for Republican mayors even to do this in 19 states.
Not Republican mayors.
Yes,
too.
Republican mayors too.
And I know you've noted elsewhere that there's also a sort of a de facto element of creating laws that have certain burdensome requirements that are difficult to interpret that could end up in the courts forever as well. So even in areas where you're able to create the networks, it's not a very inviting
No, the sand, you can get sand thrown in the gears forever. And exactly the same thing happened with electrification. Exactly the same thing.
Hi, I'm just wondering what your opinion is on creating a regulator in the United States, because it seems to me the Republicans will never agree to something like, you know, they hate big government. They'll never agree to something like getting rid of, you know, the policies that allow private companies to take over the public responsibilities. And the Democrats don't seem to have done anything. Obama came in with great promises, and it's just kind of all fizzling out. So it seems to me that government initially would have to do something, and thereafter the Republicans and Democrats can fight over what the regulator is doing.
Right. Well, so this is the longer story, is that the government actors, who to a person believe they're doing the best they can, have to understand that this is actually becoming an election issue, and that it's a bipartisan issue. This is not Democratic or Republican. This is, are we going to have a successful market in America for everything we do? This is like, anyway. So what's going to need to happen is actually the political will giving cover to government actors to do what they had been doing for the 100 years previously. Actually, the FCC could do this by themselves. They don't need Congress. They could just relabel. We went through a whole fight on this 2 years ago. They could relabel what these services are and re-regulate them without going back to Congress. But it looked like World War III to them because of all the money on the other side. So again, I'm trying to be optimistic here. I do think that with enough energy supporting actors who want to make this system more rational, this is not a one-year project. This is probably a 5-year, 10-year project, but it is going to happen. It happened with electricity. It's going to happen here. Okay. It's got to.
We move over questions on this side, or yeah, just to move to the other side of the room here.
Sorry, I heard an Irish politician on radio being asked about, it wasn't even fibre, it was about getting cable to remote areas of Ireland the other day, and his answer was you can't force companies to do this, and that if you try and force them when they get a license, that they have to bring cable to the unprofitable areas, that they won't come in, and that'll competition won't work. So do you think we can force the companies to provide, I suppose, fibre optic as well as DSL, or is this going to prevent, say, the competition of cables coming in?
Well, this is the battle of utility regulation. The idea is that in exchange for the right to serve a rich area, that carries with it the obligation to serve other areas. Companies are perfectly willing to do it if they're subsidized. Sometimes that's necessary, get guarantees of traffic. We did this for the telephone. Are there telephones throughout Ireland? I believe there are. And it's just, it takes some thought. You have to think of the whole thing as a system. And urban areas do cross-subsidize rural areas. That's what happens. So in Australia, 93% of the people in Australia are going to get fiber to the home under the current government. And people in hard-to-reach areas are going to get just wireless or satellite, because it is too difficult to get fiber to them, the rest, the 7%. But everybody's going to pay the same. Everybody's going to pay the same, because the idea is that this is an intentional national program. And it's going to knit the country together, and it should be that way. So yes, the country, force is a pretty strong word. If the idea is that as a condition of having the franchise, of getting access to the rights of way, that carries with it public burdens.
So is it as simple as legislating for that then?
Yeah,
do we have to wait for
simple.
Well,
Yes, it is as simple as both legislating and regulating. That's how it works. Yeah, both. But the reason I'm so focused on fiber is that cable is always going to be a second best network, and that making that one-time fiber investment will make more sense for the country than continuing to work with the cable companies.
Okay, that's it.
Hi, Susan. I just had a question, if you could maybe explain in more detail how Chattanooga was able to introduce it in their city, and why other cities would not be so jealous that they had this, that they'd force it for their own cities.
Oh, it's a great story. There's with all of these municipal stories, there's a hero at the heart of it, an actual person who decided this was really important. And there was somebody who'd been involved with the electrical utility and saw all those lines running to everybody's house, and was also worried about power outages that were happening, and thinking that if they only had better information about power use, they'd be able to counter those outages. So actually, the fiber network grew out of a concern over power outages. If you could have smart grids in everybody's house, you'd just have much better information. You wouldn't have to cut the whole network in order to address one problem. You could actually go right to the source. And then they discovered, byproduct, this is great, we've got fiber. And so they have this blazingly fast network, and these new businesses are coming in. I think that the US Conference of Mayors is just today or yesterday, they've just started talking about adding broadband to their list of agenda items. This whole thing has been slow to get to the public consciousness in America. So not everybody knows about Chattanooga. I'm sure Knoxville, Tennessee does. I'm sure Nashville does, but not the entire country. The mainstream media, for whatever reason, has not been interested in this issue. It has a few acronyms, it has a learning curve, feels a little dull. So what we really need, I don't know if you remember, but there's a movie about water rights called Chinatown, which involves incest and murder. And then everybody gets excited. So we need a better movie about fiber, because it's just as boring as water rights. But yet, people's lives are going to depend on it. And so there are a few documentaries being made right now about fiber in America. I think they're going to have an impact, because we react to stories in a way that may get reporters more interested in this.
Is there an element as well that Americans tend to think that they have the most advanced network and just think they don't know that these networks are there in these other places? So it's like we have the best, and out there it's worse.
Yeah, we're traditionally uninterested in what other countries are doing. So you can say until you're red in the face, but look at Hong Kong. I don't care. What is Hong Kong doing? What is China doing? So, but the rumor is that China's going to have 300 million people attached to fiber to the home. That as an industrial policy, as a sort of that kind of country, you can do stuff like that. You can build dams, high-speed rail, and fiber. So they're moving ahead on this, but we don't react to that kind of stuff.
That might create a sort of a space race for this the
we
new
don't
millennium,
react.
I suppose, because it was the threat of Russians getting into space first
that worked then. I'm not sure it works now
anymore.
I mean, I hope to evoke all of these nationalistic
wave a flag.
fears at some point, but it doesn't seem to be the thing that gets people. I think what will get people is visuals. That's why this World's Fair idea is so important, to have demonstrations of just what it's like to wield all this information. You guys saw Tom Cruise in was it Matrix, right? Or which movie is it? Minority Report.
The Minority Report, yeah.
Why not? We could do that, and that should be part of our lives. And it's not just for entertainment. It is actually for job creation. There's a real connection there.
We'll
So-
take the technology and not the Tom Cruise
Right,
element
right.
of it maybe at the moment, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, your talk is very interesting, but I just wanted to make two comments. Firstly, on your comment about it's about legislation, regulation and legislation. I do think that there's a lot about the technology as well, because technology is not a neutral thing, and you can build a fibre network in a way that makes it harder to share and harder
Yes,
to,
that's right.
to support competition. So I think that while you can persuade the public or the decision makers by showing them, we'll say, the applications, there is a greater need for people to understand that the choices you make do penetrate that physicality of the network and actually really influence what's
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah,
And you
that's
can
right.
build a network now in a way that you'll kind of pay for in the future. And I think we need to work on how we do that.
Yep.
So it's not just about the applications. So that's one point. And just the second point, this is just a comment, and perhaps you've done this already. I think you can use wireless to your advantage much more in
Yep.
selling your story, because the reality is 4G networks, LTE, the backhaul network can't support what we
Right.
have, and they will need fibre solutions to that. So our beloved wireless, I think, as you called it, we won't be able to have what we have without that changing. So I think
right.
that can also motivate people who might be more kind of, I suppose, attached to their smartphones and that experience.
Those are two great comments. Stockholm has done a wonderful job architecting its fiber network. So there is a wholesale layer, there are many, many, many retail layers, and they made sure that it was home-run fiber that could be shared. And we just should all look to our neighbor to the north, see how they did it. But that's absolutely right. The technology can be architected, even a fiber network. The one built by Verizon, for example, is very difficult to share. And that means that there's a gatekeeper. It's just, my hope is, maybe this is idealistic, that because there's so much abundance in the fiber, there's less of an incentive to start counting who's doing what. But then you have to have rate regulation to make sure that people are protected from abusive pricing by that single actor. And that's a tricky thing. But you're right about wireless. You know, in the US, there's this whole kerfuffle now about the spectrum, looming spectrum crisis. My belief is that it's actually a building fiber to the towers crisis, and that if there was a better backhaul network, our calls wouldn't be dropping all over New York City. The mayor asked me about that. He said, "No, why do our calls keep dropping in New York City?" And I said, "Well, it really is backhaul. And there's so many people sharing these towers that the fiber network can't handle it. The tower network can't handle it."
But here and then maybe down here next.
Yes.
So.
Hi, Susan.
Hi.
I love that you talk about gigabit connectivity as a utility and as a right, and it makes perfect sense in a sort of looking forward, building, needing this infrastructure sort of argument. And so I guess my question is, how can I better articulate that to, my dial-up using parents who, don't see that as, anything more than a sort of luxury thing. I
Right.
mean, to my point of view, a web developer, it's essential.
Right.
mean, and it's needed to go forward. And it is a utility.
Right.
But some folks, they don't see that. They lack that vision. So
Right.
how I can better argue that, I guess, is my question.
You may not be able to argue it to people who have never had the experience of using it and can't see its use. It was the same thing for electricity. There were lots of homes where people sort of had it as an object in the front hall and didn't want it to spread to other rooms of the house because they felt invaded. Same thing with the telephone. There were a lot of people who were terrified of the telephone when it first came up. It's going to be, when people get accustomed to it or see it at their jobs, see it in other places, then it begins to get adopted. But telling the story, you're just going to have to say, trust me on this one. This is like the electrification. Do you remember when your place didn't have electricity? And just hope that somebody remembers that. Or something like that. The difference between a bike path and a superhighway. Using highway metaphors actually really helps. So, and you can even say, look, if you're using a wireless connection, it's probably going to allow your bike to go on like this, but if you had a highway, you could be doing this, and then look at all this information, and then they'll at least appreciate you in the abstract, if not support you, actually, in the political realm.
Okay, I think we're over here.
Hello, this is a very basic question. How far along the chain does the fibre optic cable have to go? Does it have to go all the way from the central network to the home?
Yes.
It has to go
Has to go all the way to the home.
All the way, right,
Yeah.
okay. Thanks very much.
Right. AT&T in the U.S. builds a second kind of service, which has copper from the neighborhood central office to the homes, and that could never compete with the fiber all the way to the home service. The basic thing should be fiber all the way to the home.
We'll go here, and then do we have any questions waiting over here? No? Why is this the quiet side, and all the questions are over here?
Yeah, so just seen recently Penguin Computing, which are a high-performance platform and hardware provider, have been doing interesting work with universities, and they have a 3-level system for how they promote high-performance computing in business and academia. I was wondering, have you looked at that sort of model to promote the fibre to the node and fibre to the home, and get those speeds to the 20-somethings you were talking about, so that they see the advantages and then it proliferates that way, rather than trying to go to big business? And I mean, you're talking about a perfect storm there, where you've got people who don't know the service that's available, you have vendors that aren't really willing to promote it, and then financial markets that have no interest in changing the status quo. Right. Is that something you've looked at? Have you any
actually,
other plans?
There's a guy in the States. It's a wonderful question. There's a whole effort called Gig.U in the States, which is being run by Blair Levin, who was the author of the National Broadband Plan that the FCC put out in 2010. He's gathered together 29 or more universities. His pitch is that innovation is going to happen in university towns. So what we need to do is get gig networks to universities, and then let wireless clouds, come off of those to their surrounding communities. He's absolutely focused on that. And one side benefit could be that you addict kids to having this network, and then wherever they go, they make sure it's there. I'm worried about the Rooseveltian aspects of this, that not all good ideas come only from university towns. That there's going to be somebody in a remote location that we need to reach, and they need to be part of the social fabric as well as the university towns. As close as I feel to universities, they're not everything. And they also they're not serving racial minorities as widely. It's just, there's a whole story of inequality that's not served by only getting to the universities, but it's a great step. And certainly addicting the students to this is one way of putting pressure on it.
And we'll take a question here, and I know we need to be, I think we're reaching the
Are we?
tail end. Are there any?
He's got the mic and he's waving his hand.
Yeah, we've got one here, and then I know far away here. Yeah.
You win. Go.
I was just wondering if private companies, the cable companies, decide to swap to fiber, how long it will take for them to get back the investment? We were talking.
I'm not sure. Well, if they can charge whatever they want to, they could figure that out. It is a major investment for them because they use particular frequencies for their upstream that are different from their downstream frequencies. They'd really have to swap out everything to make this work. I don't know how much. I just don't know the answer to that question. But I undertake to go figure that out. So I will go figure that out.
I guess, as you say, the issue is really the financing to enable these places to do this, to create so that they've got a long-term loan which they don't need to repay right away, so they can make money off of all of us at a reasonable speed, but also giving us this fresh level of connectivity is really the idea, isn't it?
Right, but right now there are no price controls at all on cable. So the packages, I just wrote a book about this captive audience, and the sports plays a big role in the cable model too, and we're seeing that all over Europe. That sort of drives up charges and gets content in it too. So read my book.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, I have a question from all the way up the back.
Hey.
I think one of the issues that we have had here is that incumbents in the country, like Aircom and BT, have been burned by the kind of residential broadband market, so to speak. A lot of them have lost a lot of money on it. Now, a lot of that's probably got to do with poor acquisitions and stuff like that. But they may be less inclined to invest money in something that hasn't historically worked all that well for them in the first place.
Yeah. Well, if you're a utility, you're a utility. It's really just a decision that someone has to set a high standard for what's basic, what customer service is required, what the quality of line is. We did all this for the telephone, and it worked. I can't understand, and maybe I'm just slow, why we couldn't take that same approach to fiber to the home. Setting standards, making it a national priority and then getting it to everyone.
Okay.
Even if they've been burned, they have made a lot of money in the past. So they were attractive enough to Blackstone for them to buy it. So there must be something there.
True enough. And a last question, anybody? Or is that, I think,
anybody?
Maybe we've got one more down here. Or am I okay going for two final questions? Maybe here, if they're brief questions, please. Yeah,
okay.
We'll take these final two, and then we'll wrap up on that. So.
On the aisle.
There.
Hi there. One of the big things you mentioned about the potential of Fibre is the possibilities it offers for engagement and interaction with people. Obviously, the internet has already, given people engagements and interactions that they wouldn't have had before, and that's often been very positive, but also sometimes not so positive.
Right.
Do you have any feelings about what might be done to foster the positive kind of engagement as opposed to the negative?
Well, I think that the best software is between the ears, and I think that as we get used to, we're just at the very beginning of this story. We don't really know what effect the internet even has had on us. Now I'm saying there's a whole second shift that's going to happen. It'll take a new form of literacy. Our brains are probably changing as a result of some of this. In my view, the benefits far outweigh the burdens, and we'll find ways of protecting kids and getting high quality content out there. We've done it before. We'll do it again. We're a cheerful and resilient group of people. But to not make the upgrade because we're worried about that, to say that the internet is not just a cesspool of fear, I think that's a mistake. And the same kind of thing was said about the telephone, by the way.
And it was true.
Hi. Thanks. Very interesting talk. Just on your suggestion about ideas that could capture the imagination and drive it, an interesting talk that took place in Dublin very recently was Tim Berners-Lee was speaking about the power of big data and having data sensors capturing and recording information, and then the power of big computation really driving analytics and to what's happening in the world. And I think if you look at some of the predictions that he projected, they all presuppose an existence of big connectivity. And when you bring the two together, it is quite a
That's a great meshing. So I'm teaching in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, and one of the most joyous sights I saw recently was a beautiful spring morning, about 9:45 or something, and there in this gorgeous black convertible comes Sir Tim Berners-Lee driving down the street. I felt so lucky. I'm here, he's here. What did I do to deserve this? It's great. He's a wonderful man, and he's right. Of course this all combines. It's about using this enormous power of computation plus connectivity plus everything that's possible to be more intelligent about our lives. So thank you for that. That's great.
Okay. I think we'll wind up there. Certainly the engagement and the response and the curiosity of the audience is a testimony to how interesting and what a great spark that talk actually was. Spark. And what I hope is it will send people away. I mean, clearly it will send people away thinking about this issue, and hopefully make all of you feel like it's time to get engaged with politicians and push these issues. And it certainly helps to have had them laid out in such a comprehensible way for all of us as well, on an issue which can seem quite obscure and distant and intangible. So please, thank you to the audience, and can we all give a thank you to Susan Crawford for that wonderful talk.